Yes, I need to move the body into. The question is whether it's a question of justice or not. Actually, is a good point to start because we were left with this notion of reorientation as justice, and I put the question to you whether indeed reorientation in and of itself is a notion of justice or not. I want to focus my very brief comment on this very rich and quite fascinating paper on the notion of space. I want to limit myself to the spatial element, simply because the metaphysics of materials or the ontology of materials is something that I still have to think about. I have to process it. So we all know that space is really central to the very understanding of law. Justice Aaron Barak famously states that the law is everywhere. So our first class in law school, we deal with the notion that there is no space outside the law. And now comes the question of what is the law. So one way of to analyze it is to say, well, let's look very closely at the legal molecules that we breathe, that surround us, that define us, that we define them. And here we have a continuum of discretion. So for Aaron Barak, the law defines discretion. So to the extent that we have more discretion, then it's one thing, and to the extent that our discretion is limited, that's on the other side of the spectrum. And I take it that what you might mean by atmosphere, according to Barak's perception, would be that there's very little discretion, because you're almost suffocated with law to the sense that there's only one possible move for you to, or only one possible aim for you to reach. Another way to perhaps make this point is through the concept of density rather than discretion. So if we recognize some insights from the law and geography movement, then we realize that the law is unevenly or unequally distributed throughout space, throughout social space and physical space. So then there are centers of powers, all kinds of power: social power, capital power, state power, bureaucratic power, etc. And here it's interesting because the density of the law seems different on the trenches. Maybe the law is just more dense on the trenches because the military codes sort of, again, saturate the space. Now this raises a really interesting question with respect to law under extreme conditions at large, not just the trenches. And there's a paradox, because one would think that under extreme conditions the law is really dense because the state needs to regulate everything. You have full state power, and therefore the code, the military code or the other code, has to be really explicit. On the other hand, we know that so in this perspective, the law shines its brightest during extreme conditions. But on the other hand, we can say the law is the most sparse under extreme conditions because necessity knows no law. And we see this withdrawal, and we see really interesting types of behavior when the law reaches this limit of really extreme conditions. Are you acting outside the law and then let the lawyers worry about it later? They will legalize it, do that, do the other, whatever, what have you. But we're now in a really particular condition, and I'm totally aware that the notion of condition that's a loaded term. I don't have time to enter it now, but it's space, it's, as you say, emotion, it's social occurrence, condition. I'm putting Heidegger aside just for the sake of our conversation. I want to move maybe to the particularities very briefly, because I'm fully aware of the time constraints here. So we have lawscape and we have atmosphere, and I take it that there's some sort of, again, in my mind, there's a bit of a dilemma here. Is this a continuum? Or do you move from an atmosphere to a lawscape under you? So is there a border or not? I will return to this notion of a border in a minute, but I want to suggest that perhaps to tie the two presentations together, perhaps we talk about environment. Mm-hmm. So what we actually mean is, and then, law and society and environments, that we talk about the legal environment and we know about, so perhaps it would be useful to situate those two entities, lawscape and atmosphere, as part of a larger entity, which is the environment, from which there's no outside. I mean, you cannot I guess you can never be outside an environment. That goes, there's a Lumanian understanding of a system theory here, that you cannot be outside a system. That's another point. I want to, with your permission, just focus on this no man's land, because I think it's really important. I want to suggest perhaps something that you might find interesting, and that is the notion of an enclave. It's something I've written on with respect to a different film, one not from the First World War, but the Second World War, Casablanca. Oh, exactly. And the idea there is that the law in general operates through enclaves. Procedural law, what is it if not an enclave? You keep some stuff outside, you put some things in, and the architecture of a courtroom is about enclaves. So I don't have the time to really develop this notion of an enclave. But it seems to me that the no man's land is a classic enclave. This is precisely what happens, you know, when the three systems coalesce, so to say, or intersect. So you have this notion of an enclave, which I think is quite useful, through which to analyze not only the extreme condition, but law in general. I want to return and conclude my comment with this notion of a border. First of all, because trenches are borders. That's what they are. They are the cutting edge, literally speaking, the cutting where you cut, the cutting edge of war, and therefore the cutting edge of jurisdiction. This is where your jurisdictions end, exactly at the trenches. And I want to suggest something that I've written in another paper, that what law does is law creates borders. This is what it does. And the way in which it creates border is through generating friction. And then again, it goes to the material element that you raised before. When we legalize something, there's a legal bureaucracy, there's a legal machinery that goes with it. And what it does is it creates social friction. You have to get a permission from someone, you have to apply for discretion for somebody else, and that's friction. And you can control the friction, you can make it goes back to the discretion, you can make the friction really very smooth, going to the mall, very smooth. Or you can heighten the friction, turn the knob, and then the friction becomes really troubling. So here's the case of, the friction was so much that people just had to have an outlet. Now, by the way, the outlet, of course, is through Christendom. Mm-hmm. So if you didn't have the religion there, I'm not sure it would similarly work. It hasn't happened elsewhere. No. It has to have some either customs of the space or religion of the space or something like that to alleviate the friction. Otherwise, the friction just becomes unbearable. So I suggest to us to think about law in general as a mode of generating social friction, in which case this is how we regulate environment.
Thank you.
I conclude.